Has there been a story over the years that you got beat on or someone else did and you wanted to do it and you got a little ticked off?
They're always look, whenever there's a big story, if you're competitive and you've got, that kind of drive to break news, to get the big interview, whatever it might be, there's always, there always going to be people who beat you, right? There are always people who are breaking big stories. Off the top of my head, nothing comes to mind, but there have been many such.
But that's good that you don't have one that's sort of eating away at you.
It haunts me.
Yeah. I don't know if it's like I think about who was it? Peter Gammons or the first interview with A-Rod after the steroids, or I mentioned OJ before.
I had my fair share. You'd always like to get some more of them. If it's on your beat and somebody else gets it, but really, no. Look, some of them, right? You can do an interview, right? But are you going to be able to ask the questions that you really want to ask?
Right.
I've interviewed Tom Brady. Have we ever done the definitive interview where he talks about everything? To the best of my knowledge, nobody's done that interview, right? So
I think the one who's actually,
hey, we're talking about everything.
Right.
They sit down for interviews, but there are certain parameters and even unspoken ground rules, right? In those situations with the biggest of the big. And sometimes, those accommodations are made and you say, all right, well, we're talking about this today rather than that. But if you do the big interview with the biggest figures from sport over the last here's the one.
Okay, good. We got there.
I'm thinking, okay. So, for many years I covered Lance Armstrong. And there was a point at which I was literally in the Denver airport. I had just been in Aspen, Colorado at a conference, and I get to the airport in Denver, having left Aspen, and this big conference annual thing, the Aspen Ideas Festival thing is going on in Aspen. And I do a bunch of this. In those days, I did some sports stuff for them. And I get a phone call and they say, hey, can you get back? And I think it was Walter Isaacson himself who led the festival, said, can you come back to Aspen? Lance Armstrong wants to do an interview to finish off the festival live in front of the whole festival, like in the big arena, I don't know, 5,000, 6,000 people, and talk about everything. Everything's on the tape. Okay. And this is kind of like when, I don't know, at this point, USADA's already, announced an investigation. I'm forgetting the timeline if Floyd Landis had already, called them out. But at this point, this is pre-Oprah interview. Right. And so I go back to Aspen, and then, I call my bosses and they say, okay, let's get a truck there. We're going to broadcast this live, fly in a producer. I go over to Lance's house. We have a conversation about, what this is going to look like, avoiding any kind of conversation about rules or parameters or anything like that. But, he wants to meet and talk about how he wants to talk about everything. And I'm like, okay, well, this is, I've been around Lance a lot, but this is nerve wracking because it's high stakes. It's live. There's no safety net, right? Like almost the vast majority of these things are taped, right?
Of course. Yeah.
And you got prep and all that. I've had a number of these where it's live and it's different. And Lance is a brilliant guy, and nobody knows his story better than Lance. And no one was clearly a better advocate for himself in these situations than Lance, until he finally decides to tell the truth. So I'm prepping. I'm thinking, what do I know? How am I going to do this in 24 hours, fully prepped for all of the follow-ups and all that? And then Lance canceled at the last minute. And I think
how long after that did he go on Oprah?
I think it was a few months later, like 6 months.
A few months later. Okay.
So that was frustrating.
Yeah, I would imagine. I think it's better if he would have went on Oprah like the next week.
Beat by Oprah.